Honeybee hives consist mainly of hexagonal, six-sided units called cells, in which queens lay eggs. Hexagonal cells for eggs that develop into non-reproductive workers are smaller than those for eggs that develop into reproductive drones, though the size difference varies by species. Difference in cell size results in a construction problem. It's hard to neatly connect sections of small cells to sections of large cells. That worsens as the difference increases. To fill in gaps between the sections when building a hive, bees rely on cells that have more or fewer than 6 sides. A student studying beehive structure consults data on 3 species, concluding that which choice most effectively uses data from the graph to complete the student's conclusion? A. Cells for worker eggs are probably closer in size to cells for drone eggs in the hives of the western honeybee than in the hives of the dwarf honeybee and the black dwarf honeybee does. B. Both the western honeybee and the black dwarf honeybee probably reserve 8-sided cells for drone eggs, while the dwarf honeybee likely deposits drone eggs in 7-sided cells. C. The western honeybee probably relies on many more geometrical shapes when constructing cells than either the dwarf honeybee or the black dwarf honeybee does. D. The percentage of hexagonal cells is probably slightly lower in the hives of the western honeybee than in the hives of the dwarf honeybee and the black dwarf honeybee.
So in question 15, we see the percentage of non-hexagonal cells in hives of 3 honeybee species: western honeybee, dwarf honeybee and black dwarf honeybee. And then it is talking about usually and mainly hexagonal, that is 6-sided units called cells in which the queens lay eggs you would have seen. These are what the honeybee hives look like. They will have 6 sides. Hexagonal cells for eggs that develop into non-reproductive workers are smaller than those eggs that develop into reproductive drones. So if it is a proper hexagonal and quite big, it is for the drones, reproductive drones, whereas if it is smaller, it is for the other non-reproductive workers. Though the size difference varies by species. So difference in cell size results in a construction problem. So what is going to happen? So how can the bees make a smaller hexagons and then some bigger hexagon? So that's going to be a little difficult. So it's hard to neatly connect sections of small cells to sections of large cells that worsens as the difference increases. So what they've done, to fill in gaps between the sections when building a hive, so these bees rely on maybe more or fewer than 6 sides to fill in the gaps. So the student is studying the beehive structure and consults data on 3 species, and what does he conclude? Now we can clearly see that the western honeybee, it has very less of the 5, 7 and 8-sided. All of them is very low, less than 0.5%. Only the dwarf honeybee and black honeybee, they have a lot of these 5-sided and 7-sided ones. And even the dwarf honeybee has only a few 8-sided, and black dwarf doesn't even have any 8-sided ones. So which choice should we select? So if you said A, well done, that is the best answer. Choice A is the best answer because it most effectively uses data from the graph to complete the student's conclusion about beehive structure. The text explains that in the hives of honeybees, the hexagonal cells housing drone eggs are larger than the hexagonal cells housing worker eggs, and that this size difference results in a construction problem that the bees address by using non-hexagonal cells to fill gaps between sections of drone egg cells and worker egg cells. The text also states that the size difference between drone egg cells and worker egg cells varies by species of honeybee. The graph displays data on the percentage of non-hexagonal cells in the hives of 3 species. In the hives of the western honeybee, the percentages of 5-sided, 7-sided and 8-sided cells are all less than 0.5%. But in the hives of the black dwarf honeybee, the percentages of 5-sided and 7-sided are higher than those for the western honeybee, about 2.5% for both. And for the dwarf honeybee, the percentages of 5-sided and 7-sided are also higher than those for western honeybee, slightly over 2.5% and slightly over 2% respectively. Additionally, the dwarf honeybee possesses a higher percentage of 8-sided cells than the western honeybee does. Taken all together, the graph shows that the hives of the western honeybee consists of a smaller percentage of non-hexagonal cells than the hives of the other two species do. Since the non-hexagonal cells exist only to solve the construction problem arising from the difference in size between drone egg cells and worker egg cells, a smaller percentage of non-hexagonal cells would be associated with a smaller size difference between the two types of cells. Therefore, it can be concluded from the data that worker egg cells are probably closer in size to drone egg cells in the hives of the western honeybee than in the hives of the other two species. So, western honeybees, they have the other shaped apart from the hexagonal 5-sided, 7-sided, 8-sided, very less percentage. That is because the worker eggs probably they are very closer in size for the drone egg. That's why they don't need the other sided cells at all. They need very few. So, than the hives of the dwarf honeybee and the black dwarf honeybee. So these two others, maybe there's a lot of difference between the worker eggs and the drone egg sizes, but for the western honeybee, it's not much of a difference.
Choice B is incorrect because, as the text states, honeybee species deposit their eggs in hexagonal cells, not in non-hexagonal ones. Thus, the western honeybee and black dwarf honeybee wouldn't deposit drone eggs in 8-sided cells, and the dwarf honeybee wouldn't deposit drone eggs in 7-sided cells. Choice C is incorrect. The text explains that honeybees rely mainly on one geometric shape, the hexagon, when constructing their hives, and the graph shows that the western honeybee relies on the same non-hexagonal shapes as the dwarf honeybee does, 5-sided, 7-sided, and 8-sided cells. In other words, the western honeybee and dwarf honeybee rely on the same number of geometric shapes. For the black dwarf honeybee, the graph displays data only for 5-sided and 7-sided cells, which suggests a total absence of 8-sided cells. Yet this would be only one less non-hexagonal shape than is seen in the western honeybee. Thus, based on the graph, it would be inaccurate to say that the western honeybee relies on many more geometrical shapes than the other two species do. Choice D is incorrect. As the text explains, honeybee hives consist mainly of hexagonal cells, and sections of non-hexagonal cells are used to connect sections of hexagonal cells of different sizes. Since the graph indicates that the percentage of non-hexagonal cells is lower for the western honeybee than it is for the dwarf honeybee or black dwarf honeybee does, the western honeybee would conversely have a higher percentage of hexagonal cells than either the dwarf honeybee or black dwarf honeybee does, not a lower percentage.